of how things are, which is characterised by softness and imprecision and ambiguity and paradox, I think. John really artfully uses the precision of Greek to lead the mind into the ambiguity of maybe an Aramaic or a desert worldview. So questions like that, it won't let you pin it down. I'm fond of saying to people that, John proposes a very non-geometrical relationship between God and humanity. It says later, God dwells in us, that you should dwell in me as I dwell in you, and I dwell in God as God dwells in me, and God dwells in all of us together. Cuckoo, right? So try drawing a diagram. It doesn't work. So any attempt to get specific about exactly what's going on, Christ's use of symbol, or John's use of symbol, if you like, in the writing of the gospel, is explicitly to evoke one sense of what's going on without pinning down to a specific kind of box and line diagram version of how exactly it works. And then he'll use a different symbol to illuminate a different aspect of what's going on. But it always points beyond conception.
Does John take you through a narrative through that? In the way that, for example, in high school chemistry, you might do the plum pudding model, and then next term they say, well, actually the plum pudding model is rubbish. It's actually more like this. Well, actually. So is it, for example, saying early on tabernacle,
mm-hmm.
and then later on saying temple,
mm-hmm.
because it's probably more accurately temple, but to really understand temple, you need to get in your head that it's got the tabernacle.
Let's start with tabernacle. Yeah, I mean, because the prologue's like half a page long.
So it's sort of a dynamic model rather than a static model.
Yeah, very much. And it continues. With successive readings, the dynamism continues, because each time you read through it, you go, oh, no, wait, actually that's wait on, this thing in chapter 1 connects to that thing in chapter 19, I need to walk away from a minute.
Thanks.
I was just going to say that, the problem with something as complex as the Gospel of John is that, there are many things happening at once and happening, simultaneously at different times. You have the idea, of course, which has now been, torn to pieces and not so much put back together. Of course, John is a historical record. This is the life of Jesus. He went here, he did these things happened, and then you have the accepted and the majority view that, what's happening in John is actually reflecting what's happening to the community that uses John. That this particular, that when Jesus talks to the Samaritan woman at the well, what this tells you about the community is that now they're including outsiders. And that because now he's saying, worship in spirit and, beyond the temple and the mountain, that now it's developing an anti-temple worldview, but not an anti-temple worldview from the perspective simply of theology, but the community kind of taking it out of a specific location in a specific time to say, here is where you worship God, and now expands to say, okay, this is where you worship God. And so I thought, looking interesting where you were talking about Jesus as the tabernacle and the temple, I would say a little bit with and this of course is just talking out of my butt, but Jesus is the tabernacle and the temple, then the temple becomes the world, the community, everything else, and then Jesus becomes a focus point, but still a part of that larger thing that insists we're now moving it from a space you walk into to a space that you exist in.
Thanks for giving away the rest of my talk.
Sorry.
Luckily, the video wasn't on. Damn, the audio is.
But that's just my thought. I haven't read the books or stuff that Father Tim has. I'm going from the stuff that she kind of refers back to, but I moved back.
Yeah, and there's a sense in which Dr. Coloe's books, they're certainly in the same world as Ray, but our mate Ray.
There's a whole book about this that you kind of did, really. But yet the book traces a really interesting path, and it's I really commend it to you to kind of go into it, because the depth of the depth and detail of quite how this is accomplished in the text. If you had understood the exact run of quite what temple life was like in the first century, when you read the middle part of John, the sort of 7 to 10 part of John, it's kind of like, yeah, wow, okay, right. It's making quite a big point there, yeah, I see. To us, it's kind of like, yeah, okay, then a bunch of things happened that didn't make any sense to me, and then, whatever. Dr. Coloe makes the point that, in 1:14, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling place among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, we take that word glory, doxa in Greek, to mean, Jesus was a great guy. God's awesome, right? God's glorious. We all say God's glorious, right? Glory, though, doxa, is the Greek word used in the Septuagint to refer to the manifestation of God, a cloud theophany, usually. A showing forth of God in physical form as a cloud, usually, a glowing cloud. So it was said in the Ark of the Covenant, you've all seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade?
Raiders
of the Lost Ark, beg pardon. And that's a pretty good representation of the Ark of the Covenant, really, as it's said to have existed. And the key thing is it has a pair of angels on the top, pair of cherubim, I think, if I'm correct. And the cloud theophany would form between the cherubim. And the Hebrew Bible's quite... It's not saying it was like there might have been a cloud. No, there was a cloud on top of the ark that formed between, and it glowed, and that was the presence of God. That's how we knew.
It doesn't talk about making a face melt. It doesn't talk about making a face melt.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah,
it's not so specific on the face melting parts of it.
It's just
But, in fairness to the Hebrew Bible and its failure to stick to Indiana Jones canon, there were no Nazis in Old Testament times. So it is, it's hard for them to have predicted what was going to happen.
But there is lightning.
Yep.
There is lightning, that's true.
Somebody goes, whoops, the ark is about to fall as we're marching along, and it's like, oh, rescue it, and goes to grab it, and zap.
Well, and that classic... What's
Probably
the classic
right.
scene that happens as he starts to do the ceremony to actually open the ark? A massive thunderstorm forms.
Yeah.
Lightning begins to flash. Who's showing up? The storm god. Ta-da! It's pretty...
It's Indra.
Thor, Indra, could I hitch a lift on your chariot? I don't have a way to get there. Sure, Thor, come aboard. We're all showing up, apparently. So we've got the tabernacling of God and we've got the doxa of God, both. So the John 1:14 is the promise that really what's going to happen is that the Word is sort of taking over the functions of the temple, and indeed that's in fact exactly what happens. So chapter 2, very familiar scene. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples, the family. We'll come back to that. There they stayed for a few days. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts he found men selling cattle, sheep and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords. He did the obvious next thing. He made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves he said, "Get these out of here. How dare you turn my father's house into a market?" The disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Then the Jews demanded of him, "What miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Because that was how you actually... That's fair enough. Sign...
Made out of cord.
Got a whip. It was accepted that there were prophets who could show miraculous signs that therefore gave them authority to speak on behalf of God, and that undercut all sort of civil authority in Palestine. So that would have been fine had he managed to do it. Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days." The Jews replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple." Ooh, what's happening now? "It has taken 46 years to build this temple and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words Jesus had spoken. Now while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many people saw the miraculous signs he was doing, believed in his name, etc. Now, there's a superficial level at which that passage is running, and the superficial level is kind of assisted by those little editorial comments. So, you're profaning my father's house, the disciples remembered zeal for your house will consume him. The temple he spoke of was his body, just in case you're a bit slow. Okay, you're missing the symbol? Okay, cool. After he rose, then... So 3 days was also the length of the Sinai period. where Moses received Torah. It's the other important thing about 3 days. It's not just a reference to the resurrection, it's also a reference back to Moses. The important thing about, so that text, that little passage in John is almost universally read in mainstream Christianity as, it's bad to sell doves in churches. Don't sell doves in churches, God doesn't like it. Also, additionally, don't run a bureau de change out the side, because that's also bad. Now that would make perfect sense as an interpretation, and it's what that text implies, because with the editorial comments it's saying the problem was it was a market. It was turning the temple into a market, and that, so that's the superficial reading of the text. Now, what else is going on in here is that the normal run of temple life in first century Palestine was that in order to offer proper worship to God, you had to make sacrifices. You had to have a dove or an animal or something else to make a ritual blood sacrifice to please God. That was a standard way of offering praise and prayer to God. People came from all over the Jewish world to the temple in order to do that. They had to be able to change money, and they had to be able to buy livestock to slaughter. It was absolutely essential to the ritual life of the temple. So the other thing that's going on in this is Jesus is also saying, this whole ritual life of the temple thing you got going on here, that's done. So he's overturning the cult life of the temple. By removing that part of it, it makes the rest of it impossible. And that's the first step. That's his first kind of foot in the ground. Okay, so let's stop all this business. Slaughtering animals. I'm a vegan. Pleaded peanut gallery over here. So first it's promised, then he begins this overturning process and really says, destroy this temple and I will raise it 3 days. And what he's proposing there, as the text literally says, is, okay, what's going to happen? What's the miraculous sign you can show us? I'll tell you a miraculous sign. I'm going to take over the entire function of the temple in my own being, which he then proceeds to, at a symbolic level, do in chapters 7 to 10. So chapter 7 to 10 happens through the Feast of Tabernacles. And step by step, which I won't go through because it will take too long, and I don't have it in my head, but step by step, Dr. Coloe traces at each of the phases through chapter 7 to 10, Christ effectively replaces the steps of the Feast of Tabernacles with things he does amongst the community of the disciples. So he's really saying, I'm taking on, in my person, all the functions of the temple. I sort of go through all the feasts that are normally celebrated at the temple, and they celebrate them in the community around Jesus. So Jesus takes over the function of the tabernacling presence of God. This sort of reaches some... it'd be good to say it reaches a high point, but actually that's at the beginning of the sequence. Let me see... On the last and greatest day of the feast, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, streams of living water will flow from within him. By this he meant the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive. Up to that time the Spirit had not yet been given. So we're sort of preempting, since Jesus had not yet been glorified. Well, that's actually an important part. But if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, streams of living water will flow from within him. It's not the first time he's said that. He's also said that to the Saint Faustina, the Samaritan woman at the well, when he promises... I should know this because it's from the words of institution in the Mass. How does it go? I just read it off
The water that
from the offertory, sorry. That the Logos shall give him shall never thirst. The water that the Logos shall give him shall be a well living water that's streaming into lasting life. Humble. That phrase, living water, is an interesting phrase. It's not the first time the phrase living water gets used in the whole run of the Bible. It gets used in Isaiah to particularly refer to the legitimate function of the temple. And it's particularly used in Ezekiel 47, which it would be... Sorry?
Makes me think of Genesis.
The Spirit of God on the face of the water. Yeah.
It's kind of one of those really early ones.
That's not specifically living water.
It doesn't say living water. So living water in this sense means fresh water. because it's water in which the kind of fish they wanted to eat would live, right? So there's in the scene in Ezekiel 47, which I probably should have set aside and something I could read out, but I haven't. The scene in Ezekiel 47, Ezekiel has a vision and the man shows him the temple, and a stream of living water flows from under the temple, and they cross somewhere and the water comes up to their ankles, and then they cross to another place and the water comes up to their knees, and they cross to another place and the water comes up to their thighs, and the water continues to flow from under the temple and flows throughout the land, bringing the land to fertility, and flows out into the sea and makes creatures and fish live even unto the sea in which men can fish, and the whole land returns to fertility. So there's a sense, there's a clear temple reference to this streams of living water thing, that water flows from the gift of the temple and nourishes the land and brings the world back to life. So it accomplishes a kind of re-identification of the world in Ezekiel. So just simply that phrase, this is one example of kind of just a little phrase that gets used in very specific places in the Hebrew Bible amongst the prophets. Kind of, for someone at that time hearing it, kind of goes, living water, yeah, okay, yeah, I see what you're saying, yeah, I get it. So then the final sort of stages of, or the sort of close to final stages of the replacement of the temple happens in the house at Bethany with Mary and Martha after the raising of Lazarus, and Jesus is anointed with ointment, and the odour of the ointment fills the house. So that's exactly what happens to the ark. The tabernacle is anointed by the people with myrrh, with fragrant oil. That's a gift of the people in order to sanctify the ark in the books of Moses. And it explicitly says, there's all these sort of little detailed phrases, you think that's a weird little, what's that doing? The fragrance of the oil filled the whole house such that everyone could smell it, I think it says in the passage in John. Okay, nice. Well, so I guess it was good or something. You know, like what's the point of that particular detail? The point of the particular detail is that the implications of this act of saying Jesus is the tabernacle and presence of God, Jesus has replaced the temple, expands to touch everyone in the whole household. And we're reconnecting with the household symbol, which I'll come back to. So the final steps of the replacement of the temple is I must be lifted up, and there's a clear reference to Moses lifting the serpent over the people for healing. I must be lifted up in order for this to be accomplished. The scene at the foot of the cross where he is finally lifted up, he's crucified and he's hanging on the cross. The scene that we all love and we all constantly refer to of his mother Mary and the beloved disciple standing at the foot of the cross, and he accomplishes the moment. The beloved disciple, Ray Brown is really strict on this, and Mary Coloe follows Dr. Brown in the same thinking. The beloved disciple is the kind of stand-in for us. The beloved disciple is the exemplar disciple of the community. He or she is the person who kind of stands for what is correct behaviour for someone in the community. What's the right relationship to have to Christ? So standing at the foot of the cross, Christ is hanging on the cross and says, "Child, this is your mother. Mother, this is your son. Woman, this is your son." There's a whole lovely loop in there where, never mind, which I won't go into. Sorry, I'm descending down into the hypertext of Mary Coloe's actual book, and I just need to stand back and stick to the salient points. Right. Okay. And then it says, now, it's usually translated as, and then he said, "It is finished," and breathing his last, he gave up his spirit. And Dr. Coloe digs into the Greek of exactly that phrase, because that's a very important phrase. He said, "It is finished." And he gave what? He gave, so Greek prepositions don't work quite the same way as English prepositions. There's not a one-to-one correspondence. So the preposition in Greek, I don't know what it is, but the preposition in Greek can get translated as gave up, but it can also be translated as gave over. And so he's been saying all along in the preparation for the end, the work will get done. I need to go because I need to finish the work. I need to go and prepare a place. The Spirit will come to look after you, but that can't happen until I go. So I have to go so the Spirit can come. How does the Spirit come? He says, "It is finished," and he gives over his Spirit. So he creates this germ of this beginning acorn of a new thing. "Child, this is your mother, woman, this is your son," and he gives over his Spirit and creates something kind of completely new. The work isn't quite done, there's another little bit, but we'll come back to that. So he gives over his spirit, and that's it, right? He does. That's the end.